Chapter 31. In consequence of which I am set at liberty, and prevail upon Morgan to accept of his freedom on the same terms. Macshane's malice. We arrive at Jamaica, from whence in a short time we beat up to Hispaniola, in conjunction with the West India squadron. We take in water, sail again, and arrive at Carthagena. Reflections on our conduct there meanwhile. A quarrel happening between the two modern Greeks, the one, to be revenged of the other, came and discovered to us the mystery of Macshane's dialogue, as I have explained it above. This detection coming to the ears of the doctor, who was sensible that, now we were in sight of Jamaica, we should have an opportunity of clearing ourselves before a court-martial, and at the same time of making his malice and ignorance conspicuous, he interceded for us with the captain so effectually that in a few hours we were set at liberty and ordered to return to our duty. This was a happy event for me, my whole body being blistered by the sun, and my limbs benumbed by want of motion. But I could scarce persuade the Welshman to accept of this indulgence. He persisted in his obstinacy to remain in irons until he should be discharged by a court-martial, which he believed would also do him justice on his enemies. At length I represented to him the precarious issue of a trial, the power and interest of his adversaries, and flattered his revenge with the hope of wreaking his resentment with his own hands upon Macshane after our return to England. This last argument had more weight with him than all the rest, and prevailed upon him to repair with me to the cockpit, which I no sooner entered than the idea of my departed friend presented itself to my remembrance, and filled my eyes with tears. We discharged from our mess the boy who had acted so perfidiously, notwithstanding his tears, entreaties, and of penitence for what he had done, but not before he had confessed that the surgeon had bribed him to give evidence against us, with a pair of stockings and a couple of old check shirts, of which his servant had since plundered him. The keys of our chests and lockers being sent to us by the doctor, we detained the messenger until we had examined the contents. And my fellow mate, finding all his Cheshire cheese consumed to a crust, his brandy exhausted, and his onions gone, was seized with a fit of choler, which he discharged on Macshane's man in oaths and execrations, threatening to prosecute him as a thief. The fellow swore in his turn that he never had the keys in his possession till that time, when he received them from his master with orders to deliver them to us. "As God is my judge," cried Morgan, "and my salvation and my witness, whosoever has pilfered my provisions is a lousy, beggarly, rascally knave. And by the soul of my grandsire, I will impeach and accuse and indict him of a robbery if I did but know who he is." Had this misfortune happened at sea, where we could not repair the loss, in all probability this descendant of Caractacus would have lost his wits entirely. But when I observed how easy it would be to remedy this paltry mischance, he became more calm and reconciled himself to the occasion. A little while after this transport, the surgeon came into the berth, under pretense of taking something out of the medicine chest, and, with a smiling aspect, wished us joy of our deliverance, which, he said, he had been at great pains to obtain of the captain, who was very justly incensed at our behavior. But he, the doctor, had passed his word for our future conduct, and he hoped we should give him no cause to repent of his kindness. He expected, no doubt, an acknowledgment from us for this pretended piece of service, as well as a general amnesty of what was past. But he had to do with people who were not quite so apt to forgive injuries as he imagined, or to forget that, if our deliverance was owing to his mediation, our calamity was occasioned by his malice. I therefore sat silent, while my companion answered, "Aye, 'tis no matter, Cot knows the heart. There is a time for all things, as the wise man saith. There is a time for throwing away stones, and to gather them up. He seemed to be disconcerted at this reply and went away in a pet, muttering something about ingratitude and fellows, of which we did not think fit to take any notice. Our fleet, having joined another that waited for us, lay at anchor about a month in the harbor of Port Royal in Jamaica, during which time something of consequence was certainly transacted, notwithstanding the insinuations of some, who affirmed we had no business at all in that place. That, in order to take the advantage of the season proper for our enterprise, the West India Squadron, which had previous notice of our coming, ought to have joined us at the west end of Hispaniola, with necessary stores and refreshments, from whence we could have sailed directly for Carthagena, before the enemy could put themselves in a good posture of defense, or, indeed, have an inkling of our design. We loitered here some days longer, taking in wood and brackish water, in the use whereof, however, our admiral seemed to consult the health of the men, by restricting each to a quart a day. Here, again, certain malicious people took occasion to blame the conduct of their superiors, by saying that in so doing they not only unprofitably wasted time, which was very precious, considering the approach of the rainy season, but also allowed the Spaniards to recollect themselves from a terror occasioned by the approach of an English fleet, at least 3 times as numerous as ever appeared in that part of the world before. But if I might be allowed to give my opinion of the matter, I would ascribe this delay to the generosity of our chiefs, who scorned to take any advantage that fortune might give them even over an enemy. At last, however, we weighed, and anchored again somewhat nearer the harbor's mouth, where we made shift to land our marines, who encamped on the beach, in despite of the enemy's shot, which knocked a good many of them on the head. This piece of conduct, in choosing a camp under the walls of an enemy's fortification, which I believe never happened before, was practiced, I presume, with a view of accustoming the soldiers to stand fire, who were not as yet much used to discipline, most of them having been taken from the plough-tail a few months before. This expedient, again, has furnished matter for censure against the ministry, for sending a few raw recruits on such an important enterprise, while so many veteran regiments lay inactive at home. But surely our governors had their reasons for so doing, which possibly may be disclosed with other secrets of the deep. Perhaps they were loth to risk their best troops on such desperate service, or the colonel and the field officers of the old corps, who, generally speaking, enjoyed their commissions as sinecures or pensions, for some domestic services rendered to the court, refused to embark in such a dangerous and precarious undertaking, for which refusal, no doubt, they are to be much commended. Chapter 32. Our land forces being disembarked, erect a fascine battery. Our ship is ordered with 4 more to batter the port of Boca Chica, Macshane's cowardice, the chaplain's frenzy. Honest Ratlin loses 1 hand, his heroism and reflections on the battle, Crampley's behavior to me during the heat of the fight, our forces being landed and stationed, as I have already mentioned, set about erecting a fascine battery to cannonade the principal fort of the enemy. And in something more than 3 weeks, it was ready to open. That we might do the Spaniards as much honor as possible, it was determined, in a council of war, that 5 of our largest ships should attack the fort on one side, while the battery, strengthened by 2 mortars and 24 cohorns, should ply it on the other. Accordingly, the signal for our ship to engage, among others, was hoisted, we being advertised, the night before, to make everything clear for that purpose. And in so doing, a difference happened between Captain Oakham and his well-beloved cousin and Councillor Makshane, which had well-nigh terminated in an open rupture. The doctor, who had imagined there was no more danger of being hurt by the enemy's shot in the cockpit than in the center of the earth, was lately informed that a surgeon's mate had been killed in that part of the ship by a cannonball from 2 small redoubts that were destroyed before the disembarkation of our soldiers, and therefore insisted upon having a platform raised for the convenience of the sick and wounded in the after hold, where he deemed himself more secure than on the deck above. The captain, offended at this extraordinary proposal, accused him of pusillanimity and told him there was no room in the hold for such an occasion, or, if there was, he could not expect to be indulged more than the rest of the surgeons of the Navy, who used the cockpit for that purpose. Fear rendering Makshane obstinate, he persisted in his demand and showed his instructions, by which it was authorized. The captain swore these instructions were dictated by a parcel of lazy poltroons who were never at sea. Nevertheless, he was obliged to comply, and sent for the carpenter to give him orders about it. But before any such measure could be taken, our signal was thrown out, and the doctor compelled to trust his carcass in the cockpit, where Morgan and I were busy in putting our instruments and dressings in order. Our ship, with others destined for this service, immediately weighed, and in less than half an hour came to an anchor before the castle of Boca Chica, with a spring upon our cable, and the cannonading, which indeed was dreadful, began. The surgeon, after having crossed himself, fell flat on the deck, and the chaplain and purser, who were stationed with us in quality of assistants, followed his example, while the Welshman and I sat upon a chest looking at one another with great discomposure, scarce able to refrain from the like prostration. And that the reader may know it was not a common occasion that alarmed us thus, I must inform him of the particulars of this dreadful din that astonished us. The fire of the Spaniards proceeded from 84 great guns, besides a mortar and small arms, in Boca Chica, 36 in Fort St. Joseph, 20 and 2 fascine batteries and 4 men of war, mounting 64 guns each. This was answered by our land battery mounted with 21 cannon, 2 mortars, and 24 cohorns, and 5 great ships of 70 or 80 guns, that fired without intermission. We had not been many minutes engaged, when one of the sailors brought another on his back to the cockpit, where he tossed him down like a bag of oats, and pulling out his pouch, put a large chew of tobacco in his mouth without speaking a word. Morgan immediately examined the condition of the wounded man and cried out, "As I shall answer now, the man is as dead as my great-grandfather." "Dead," said his comrade. "He may be dead now, for aught I know, but I'll be D if he was not alive when I took him up." So saying, he was about to return to his quarters, when I bade him carry the body along with him and throw it overboard. "D and the body," said he. "I think T's fair enough if I take care of my own." My fellow mate, snatching up the amputation knife, pursued him halfway up the cockpit ladder, crying, "You lousy rascal, is this the churchyard or the charnel house or the sepulchre or the Golgotha of the ship?" But was stopped in his career by one calling, "Yo he avast there, scaldings." "Scaldings," answered Morgan. "Cot knows T's hot enough indeed. Who are you?" "Here's one," replied the voice, and I immediately knew it to be that of my honest friend Jack Ratlin, who, coming towards me, told me, with great deliberation, he was come to be docked at last, and discovered the remains of one hand, which had been shattered to pieces with a grape shot. I lamented with unfeigned sorrow his misfortune, which he bore with heroic courage, observing that every shot had its commission. It was well it did not take him in the head. Or if it had, what then? He should have died bravely, fighting for his king and country. Death was a debt which every man owed, and must pay, and that now was as well as another time. I was much pleased and edified with the maxims of this sea philosopher, who endured the amputation of his left hand without shrinking, the operation being performed, at his request, by me, after Mackshane, who was with difficulty prevailed to lift his head from the deck, had declared there was a necessity for his losing the limb. While I was employed in dressing the stump, I asked Jack's opinion of the battle, who, shaking his head, frankly told me he believed we should do no good. For why? Because, instead of dropping anchor close under shore, where we should have to deal with one corner of Boca Chica only, we had opened the harbor and exposed ourselves to the whole fire of the enemy from their shipping and fort scent. Joseph, as well as from the castle we intended to cannonade. That, besides, we lay at too great a distance to damage the walls, and 3 parts in 4 of our shot did not take place, for there was scarce anybody on board who understood the pointing of a gun. God help us, continued he. If your kinsman, Lieutenant Bowling, had been here, we should have had other guesswork. By this time, our patients had increased to such a number that we did not know which to begin with, and the first mate plainly told the surgeon that if he did not get up immediately and perform his duty, he would complain of his behavior to the admiral and make application for his warrant. This remonstrance effectually roused Mackshane, who was never deaf to an argument in which he thought his interest was concerned. He therefore rose up, and in order to strengthen his resolution, had recourse more than once to a case bottle of rum, which he freely communicated to the chaplain, and Purser, who had as much need of such extraordinary inspiration as himself. Being thus supported, he went to work, and arms and legs were hewed down without mercy. The fumes of the liquor mounting into the parson's brain conspired with his former agitation of spirits to make him quite delirious. He stripped himself to the skin, and, besmearing his body with blood, could scarce be withheld from running upon deck in that condition. Jack Ratlin, scandalized at this deportment, endeavored to allay his transports with reason, but finding all he said ineffectual and great confusion occasioned by his frolics, he knocked him down with his right hand, and by threats kept him quiet in that state of humiliation. But it was not in the power of rum to elevate the purser, who sat on the floor wringing his hands, and cursing the hour in which he left his peaceable profession of a brewer in Rochester, to engage in such a life of terror and disquiet. While we diverted ourselves at the expense of this poor devil, a shot happened to take us between wind and water, and its course being through the purser's storeroom, made a terrible havoc and noise among the jars and bottles in its way, and disconcerted Mackshane so much that he dropped his scalpel, and falling down on his knees, pronounced his paternoster aloud. The purser fell backward, and lay without sense or motion, and the chaplain grew so outrageous that Ratlin with one hand could not keep him under, so that we were obliged to confine him in the surgeon's cabin, where he was no doubt guilty of 1,000 extravagancies. Much about this time, my old antagonist, Crampley, came down, with express orders, as he said, to bring me up to the quarterdeck, to dress a slight wound the captain had received by a splinter. His reason for honoring me in particular with this piece of service being that in case I should be killed or disabled by the way, my death or mutilation would be of less consequence to the ship's company than that of the doctor or his first mate. At another time, perhaps, I might have disputed this order, to which I was not bound to pay the least regard. But as I thought my reputation depended upon my compliance, I was resolved to convince my rival that I was no more afraid than he of exposing myself to danger. With this view I provided myself with dressings, and followed him immediately to the quarterdeck, through a most infernal scene of slaughter, fire, smoke, and uproar. Captain Oakham, who leaned against the mizzen-mast, no sooner saw me approach in my shirt, with the sleeves tucked up to my armpits, and my hands dyed with blood, than he signified his displeasure by a frown, and asked why the doctor himself did not come. I told him that Crampley had singled me out, as if by express command, at which reply he seemed surprised and threatened to punish the midshipman for his presumption after the engagement. In the meantime, I was sent back to my station and ordered to tell Makshane that the captain expected him immediately. I got safe back and delivered my commission to the doctor, who flatly refused to quit the post assigned to him by his instructions, whereupon Morgan, who I believe was jealous of my reputation for courage, undertook the affair and ascended with great intrepidity. The captain, finding the surgeon obstinate, suffered himself to be dressed, and swore he would confine Makshane as soon as the service should be over. Chapter 33. A breach being made in the walls, our soldiers give the assault and take the place without opposition. Our sailors at the same time become masters of all the other strengths near Boca Chica and take possession of the harbor, the good consequence of this success. We move nearer the town, find 2 forts deserted and the channel blocked up with sunk vessels, which however we find means to clear, land our soldiers at La Quinta, repulse a body of militia, attack the castle of St. Lazare, and are forced to retreat with great loss. The remains of our army are re-embarked, an effort of the admiral to take the town. The economy of our expedition described having cannonaded the fort during the space of 4 hours. We were all ordered to slip our cables and sheer off. But next day the engagement was renewed, and continued from the morning till the afternoon, when the enemy's fire from Boca Chica slackened, and towards evening was quite silenced. A breach being made on the other side, by our land battery, large enough to admit a middle-sized baboon, provided he could find means to climb up to it. Our general proposed to give the assault that very night, and actually ordered a detachment on that duty. Providence stood our friend upon this occasion, and put it into the hearts of the Spaniards to abandon the fort, which might have been maintained by resolute men till the day of judgment against all the force we could exert in the attack. And while our soldiers took possession of the enemy's ramparts without resistance, the same good luck attended a body of sailors, who made themselves masters of Fort St. Joseph, the Facine batteries, and 1 Spanish man-o'-war, the other 3 being burnt or sunk by the foe, that they might not fall into our hands. The taking of these forts, in the strength of which the Spaniards chiefly confided, made us masters of the outward harbor, and occasioned great joy among us, as we laid our accounts at finding little or no opposition from the town. And indeed, if a few great ships had sailed up immediately, before they had recovered from the confusion and despair that our unexpected success had produced among them, it is not impossible that we might have finished the affair to our satisfaction, without any more bloodshed. But this step our heroes disdained as a barbarous insult over the enemy's distress, and gave them all the respite they could desire, in order to recollect themselves. In the meantime, Makshane, taking the advantage of this general exultation, waited on our captain, and pleaded his own cause so effectually that he was re-established in his good graces. And as for Crampley, there was no more notice taken of his behavior towards me during the action. But of all the consequences of the victory, none was more grateful than plenty of fresh water, after we had languished 5 weeks on the allowance of a purser's quart per day for each man in the torrid zone, where the sun was vertical, and the expense of bodily fluid so great that a gallon of liquor could scarce supply the waste of 24 hours, especially as our provision consisted of putrid salt beef, to which the sailors gave the name of Irish horse. salt pork of New England, which, though neither fish nor flesh, savored of both, bread from the same country, every biscuit whereof, like a piece of clockwork, moved by its own internal impulse, occasioned by the myriads of insects that dwelt within it, and butter served out by the gill, that tasted like train oil thickened with salt. Instead of small beer, each man was allowed 3 half-quarterns of brandy or rum, which were distributed every morning, diluted with a certain quantity of his water, without either sugar or fruit to render it palatable. For which reason, this composition was by the sailors not ineptly styled necessity. Nor was this limitation of simple element owing to a scarcity of it on board, for there was at this time water enough in the ship for a voyage of 6 months, at the rate of half a gallon per day to each man. But this fast must, I suppose, have been enjoined by way of penance on the ship's company for their sins, or rather with a view to mortify them into a contempt of life, that they might thereby become more resolute and regardless of danger. How simply then do those people argue, who ascribe the great mortality among us to our bad provision and want of water, and affirm that a great many valuable lives might have been saved if the useless transports had been employed in fetching fresh stock, turtle, fruit, and other refreshments from Jamaica and other adjacent islands, for the use of the army and fleet. Seeing it is to be hoped that those who died went to a better place, and those who survived were the more easily maintained. After all, a sufficient number remained to fall before the walls of St. Lazare, where they behaved like their own country mastiffs, which shut their eyes, run into the jaws of a bear, and have their heads crushed for their valor. But to return to my narration. After having put garrisons into the forts we had taken, and re-embarked our soldiers and artillery, a piece of service that detained us more than a week, we ventured up to the mouth of the inner harbor, guarded by a large fortification on one side and a small redoubt on the other, both of which were deserted before our approach, and the entrance of the harbor blocked up by several old galleons and 2 men of war that the enemy had sunk in the channel. We made shift, however, to open a passage for some ships that favored a second landing of our troops at a place called La Quinta, not far from the town, where, after a faint resistance from a body of Spaniards who opposed their disembarkation, they encamped with a design of besieging the castle of St. Lazare, which overlooked and commanded the city. Whether our renowned general had nobody in his army who knew how to approach it in form, or that he trusted entirely to the fame of his arms, I shall not determine. But certain it is, a resolution was taken in a council of war to attack the place with musketry only. This was put in execution, and succeeded accordingly, the enemy giving them such a hearty reception that the greatest part of their detachment took up their everlasting residence on the spot. Our chief, not relishing this kind of complacence in the Spaniards, was wise enough to retreat on board with the remains of his army, which, from 8,000 able men landed on the beach near Boca Chica, was now reduced to 1,500 fit for service. The sick and wounded were squeezed into certain vessels, which thence obtained the name of hospital ships, though methinks they scarce deserved such a creditable title, seeing few of them could boast of their surgeon, nurse, or cook, and the space between decks was so confined that the miserable patients had not room to sit upright in their beds. Their wounds and stumps, being neglected, contracted filth and putrefaction, and millions of maggots were hatched amidst the corruption of their sores. This inhuman disregard was imputed to the scarcity of surgeons, though it is well known that every great ship in the fleet could have spared one at least for this duty, an expedient which would have been more than sufficient to remove this shocking inconvenience. But perhaps our general was too much of a gentleman to ask a favor of this kind from his fellow chief, who, on the other hand, would not derogate so much from his own dignity as to offer such assistance unasked. For I may venture to affirm that by this time the demon of discord with her sooty wings had breathed her influence upon our councils. And it might be said of these great men, I hope they will pardon the comparison, as of Caesar and Pompey, the one could not brook a superior, and the other was impatient of an equal. So that, between the pride of one and insolence of another, the enterprise miscarried, according to the proverb. Between two stools the backside falls to the ground. Not that I would be thought to liken any public concern to that opprobrious part of the human body, though I might with truth assert, if I durst use such a vulgar idiom, that the nation did hang on arse at its disappointment on this occasion. Neither would I presume to compare the capacity of our heroic leaders to any such wooden convenience as a joint stool or a close stool, but only to signify by this simile the mistake the people committed in trusting to the union of two instruments that were never joined. A day or two after the attempt on St. Lazar, the admiral ordered one of the Spanish men-of-war we had taken to be mounted with 16 guns and manned with detachments from our great ships in order to batter the town. Accordingly, she was towed into the inner harbor in the night and moored within half a mile of the walls, against which she began to fire at daybreak, and continued about 6 hours exposed to the opposition of at least 30 pieces of cannon, which at length obliged our men to set her on fire and get off as well as they could in their boats. This piece of conduct afforded matter of speculation to all the wits, either in the army or navy, who were at last fain to acknowledge it a stroke of policy above their comprehension. Some entertained such an irreverent opinion of the admiral's understanding as to think he expected the town would surrender to his floating battery of 16 guns. Others imagined his sole intention was to try the enemy's strength, by which he should be able to compute the number of great ships that would be necessary to force the town to a capitulation. But this last conjecture soon appeared groundless, inasmuch as no ships of any kind whatever were afterwards employed on that service. A third sort swore that no other cause could be assigned for this undertaking than that which induced Don Quixote to attack the windmill. A fourth class, and that the most numerous, though, without doubt, composed of the sanguine and malicious, plainly taxed this commander with want of honesty as well as sense, and alleged that he ought to have sacrificed private pique to the interest of his country. That, where the lives of so many brave fellow citizens were concerned, he ought to have concurred with the general without being solicited or even desired towards their preservation and advantage. That, if his arguments could not dissuade him from a desperate enterprise, it was his duty to have rendered it as practicable as possible, without running extreme hazard. That this could have been done, with a good prospect of success, by ordering 5 or 6 large ships to batter the town, while the land forces stormed the castle. By these means, a considerable diversion would have been made in favor of those troops, who, in their march to the assault and in the retreat, suffered much more from the town than from the castle. That the inhabitants, seeing themselves vigorously attacked on all hands, would have been divided, distracted, and confused, and in all probability unable to resist the assailants. But all these suggestions surely proceeded from ignorance or malevolence, or else the admiral would not have found it such an easy matter, at his return to England, to justify his conduct to a ministry at once so upright and discerning. True it is that those who undertook to vindicate him on the spot asserted that there was not water enough for our great ships near the town, though this was a little unfortunately urged, because there happened to be pilots in the fleet perfectly well acquainted with the soundings of the harbor, who affirmed there was water enough for 5 80-gun ships to lie abreast almost up to the very walls. The disappointments we suffered occasioned a universal dejection, which was not at all alleviated by the objects that daily and hourly entertained our eyes, nor by the prospect of what must have inevitably happened had we remained much longer in this place. Such was the economy in some ships that, rather than be at the trouble of interring the dead, their commanders ordered their men to throw their bodies overboard, many without either ballast or winding sheet, so that numbers of human carcasses floated in the harbor until they were devoured by sharks and carrion crows, which afforded no agreeable spectacle to those who survived. At the same time, the wet season began, during which a deluge of rain falls, from the rising to the setting sun, without intermission, and that no sooner ceases than it begins to thunder, and lighten with such continued flashing, that one can see to read a very small print by the illumination. Chapter 34. An epidemic fever rages among us. We abandon our conquests. I am seized with distemper. Write a petition to the captain, which is rejected. I am in danger of suffocation through the malice of Crampley, and relieved by a surgent. My fever increases. The chaplain wants to confess me. I obtain a favorable crisis. Morgan's affection for me proved. The behavior of Mackshane and Crampley towards me. Captain Oakham is removed into another ship with his beloved doctor, our new captain described. An adventure of Morgan, the change of the atmosphere, occasioned by this phenomenon, conspired with the stench that surrounded us, the heat of the climate, our own constitutions, impoverished by bad provisions, and our despair, to introduce the bilious fever among us, which raged with such violence that 3/4 of those whom it invaded died in a deplorable manner. The color of their skin being, by the extreme putrefaction of the juices, changed into that of soot. Our conductors, finding things in this situation, perceived it was high to relinquish our conquests, and this we did, after having rendered their artillery useless and blown up their walls with gunpowder. Just as we sailed from Boca Chica, on our return to Jamaica, I found myself threatened with the symptoms of this terrible distemper. And knowing very well that I stood no chance for my life, if I should be obliged to be in the cockpit, which by this time was grown intolerable, even to people in health, by reason of the heat and unwholesome smell of decayed provision, I wrote a petition to the captain, representing my case, and humbly imploring his permission to be among the soldiers in the middle deck, for the benefit of the air. But I might have spared myself the trouble. For this humane commander refused my request, and ordered me to continue in the place allotted for the surgeon's mates, or else be contented to be in the hospital, which, by the by, was 3 degrees more offensive and more suffocating than our own berth below. Another, in my condition, perhaps, would have submitted to his fate and died in a pet, but I could not brook the thought of perishing so pitifully, after I had weathered so many gales of hard fortune. I therefore, without minding Oakham's injunction, prevailed upon the soldiers, whose goodwill I had acquired, to admit my hammock among them, and actually congratulated myself upon my comfortable situation, which Crampley no sooner understood than he signified to the captain my contempt of his orders, and was invested with power to turn me down again into my proper habitation. This barbarous piece of revenge incensed me so much against the author that I vowed, with bitter imprecations, to call him to a severe account, if ever it should be in my power. And the agitation of my spirits increased my fever to a violent degree. While I lay gasping for breath in this infernal abode, I was visited by a sergeant, the bones of whose nose I had reduced and set to rights, after they had been demolished by a splinter during our last engagement. He, being informed of my condition, offered me the use of his berth in the middle deck, which was enclosed with canvas, and well aired by a porthole that remained open within it. I embraced this proposal with joy and was immediately conducted to the place where I was treated, while my illness lasted, with the utmost tenderness and care by this grateful halberdier, who had no other bed for himself than a hencoop during the whole passage. Here I lay and enjoyed the breeze, notwithstanding which my malady gained ground, and at length my life was despaired of, though I never lost hopes of recovery, even when I had the mortification to see, from my cabin window, 6 or 7 thrown overboard every day, who died of the same distemper. This confidence, I am persuaded, conduced a great deal to the preservation of my life, especially when joined to another resolution I took at the beginning, namely, to refuse all medicine, which I could not help thinking co-operated with the disease, and instead of resisting putrefaction, promoted a total degeneracy of the vital fluid. When my friend Morgan, therefore, brought his diaphoretic balaises, I put them into my mouth, teas true, but without any intention of swallowing them, and when he went away, spit them out and washed my mouth with water gruel. I seemingly complied in this matter, that I might not affront the blood of Caractacus by a refusal which might have intimated a diffidence of his physical capacity, for he acted as my physician, Dr. Mackshane never once inquiring about me or even knowing where I was. When my distemper was at the height, Morgan thought my case desperate, and after having applied a blister to the nape of my neck, squeezed my hand, bidding me, with a woeful countenance, recommend myself to cot and my reteemer. Then, taking his leave, desired the chaplain to come and administer some spiritual consolation to me. But before he arrived, I made shift to rid myself of the troublesome application the Welshman had bestowed on my back. The person, having felt my pulse, inquired into the nature of my complaints, hemmed a little, and began thus: "Mr. Random, God, out of his infinite mercy, has been pleased to visit you with a dreadful distemper, the issue of which no man knows. You may be permitted to recover and live many days on the face of the earth, and, which is more probable, you may be taken away and cut off in the flower of your youth. It is incumbent on you, therefore, to prepare for the great change, by repenting sincerely of your sins. Of this there cannot be a greater sign than an ingenuous confession, which I conjure you to make without hesitation or mental reservation. And when I am convinced of your sincerity, I will then give you such comfort as the situation of your soul will admit of. Without doubt, you have been guilty of numberless transgressions to which youth is subject, as swearing, drunkenness, whoredom, and adultery. Tell me, therefore, without reserve, the particulars of each, especially of the last, that I may be acquainted with the true state of your conscience. For no physician will prescribe for his patient until he knows the circumstances of his disease. As I was not under any apprehensions of death, I could not help smiling at the chaplain's inquisitive remonstrance, which I told him savored more of the Roman than of the Protestant Church, in recommending auricular confession, a thing, in my opinion, not at all necessary to salvation, and which, for that reason, I declined. This reply disconcerted him a little. However, he explained away his meaning, in making learned distinctions between what was absolutely necessary and what was only convenient, then proceeded to ask what religion I professed. I answered that I had not as yet considered the difference of religions, consequently had not fixed on anyone in particular, but that I was bred a Presbyterian. At this word the chaplain expressed great astonishment, and said he could not comprehend how a Presbyterian was entitled to any post under the English government. Then he asked if I had ever received the sacrament or taken the oaths, to which questions, I replying in the negative, he held up his hands, assured me he could do me no service, wished I might not be in a state of reprobation, and returned to his messmates, who were making merry in the wardroom, round a table well stored with bumbo, too, and wine. 2. Bumbo is a liquor composed of rum, sugar, water, and nutmeg. This insinuation, terrible as it was, had not such an effect upon me as the fever, which, soon after he had left me, grew outrageous. I began to see strange chimeras and concluded myself upon the point of being delirious. In the meantime, being in great danger of suffocation, I started up in a kind of frantic fit, with an intention to plunge myself into the sea, and, as my friend the sergeant was not present, would certainly have cooled myself to some purpose, had I not perceived a moisture upon my thigh as I endeavored to get out of my hammock. The appearance of this revived my hopes, and I had reflection and resolution enough to take the advantage of this favorable symptom, by tearing the shirt from my body and the sheets from my bed, and wrapping myself in a thick blanket, in which enclosure, for about a quarter of an hour, felt all the pains of hell. But it was not long before I was recompensed for my suffering by a profuse sweat, that, bursting from the whole surface of my skin, in less than 2 hours, relieved me from all my complaints except that of weakness, and left me as hungry as a kite. I enjoyed a very comfortable nap, after which I was regaling myself with the agreeable reverie of future happiness, when I heard Morgan, on the outside of the curtain, ask the sergeant if I was alive still. "Alive," cried the other. "God forbid he should be otherwise. He has lain quiet these 5 hours, and I do not choose to disturb him, for sleep will do him great service." "Aye," said my fellow mate, "he sleeps so sound, look you, that he will not waken till the great trump plows. Cot be merciful to his soul. He has paid his debt like an honest man. Aye, and moreover, he is at rest from all persecutions, and troubles and afflictions, of which Cot knows, and I know he had his own share, Acri. Acri. He was a promising youth indeed." So saying, he groaned grievously, and began to whine in such a manner as persuaded me he had a real friendship for me. The sergeant, alarmed at his words, came into the berth, and while he looked upon me, I smiled and tipped him the wink. He immediately guessed my meaning, and remaining silent, Morgan was confirmed in his opinion of my being dead. Whereupon he approached, with tears in his eyes, in order to indulge his grief with a sight of the object, and I counterfeited death so well, by fixing my eyes and dropping my underjaw, that he said, "There he lies, no petter than a lump of clay, Cot help me," and observed, by the distortion of my face, that I must have had a strong struggle. I should not have been able to contain myself much longer, when he began to perform the last duty of a friend, in closing my eyes and my mouth, upon which I suddenly snapped at his fingers and discomposed him so much that he started back, turned pale as ashes, and stared like the picture of horror. Although I could not help laughing at his appearance, I was concerned for his situation, and stretched out my hand, telling him I hoped to live and eat some salmagundy of his making in England. It was some time before he could recollect himself so far as to feel my pulse, and inquire into the particulars of my disease. But when he found I had enjoyed a favorable crisis, he congratulated me upon my good fortune, not failing to ascribe it, under Cot, to the blister he had applied to my back at his last visit, which, by the by, said he, must now be removed and dressed. He was actually going to fetch dressings, when I, feigning astonishment, said, "Bless me! Sure you never applied a blister to me. There is nothing on my back, I assure you." But he could not be convinced till he had examined it, and then endeavored to conceal his confusion by expressing his surprise in finding the skin untouched and the plaster missing. In order to excuse myself for paying so little regard to his prescription, I pretended to have been insensible when it was put on, and to have pulled it off afterwards in a fit of delirium. This apology satisfied my friend, who, on this occasion, abated a good deal of his stiffness in regard to punctilio. And as we were now safely arrived at Jamaica, where I had the benefit of fresh provisions and other refreshments. I recovered strength every day, and in a short time, my health and vigor were perfectly reestablished. When I got up at first, and was just able to crawl about the deck with a staff in my hand, I met Dr. Macshane, who passed by me with a disdainful look, and did not vouchsafe to honor me with one word. After him came Crampley, who, strutting up to me with a fierce countenance, pronounced, "Here's fine discipline on board, when such lazy, skulking sons of bitches as you are allowed, on pretense of sickness, to lollop at your ease, while your betters are kept to hard duty." The sight and behavior of this malicious scoundrel enraged me so much that I could scarce refrain from laying my cudgel across his pate. But when I considered my present feebleness, and the enemies I had in the ship, who wanted only a pretense to ruin me, I restrained my passion, and contented myself with telling him I had not forgot his insolence and malice, and that I hoped we should meet one day on shore. At this declaration he grinned, shook his fist, and swore he longed for nothing more than such an opportunity. Meanwhile our ship was ordered to be heaved down, victualled and watered, for her return to England, and our captain, for some reason or other, not thinking it convenient for him to revisit his native country at this time, exchanged with a gentleman, who, on the other hand, wished for nothing so much as to be safe without the tropic, all his care and tenderness of himself being insufficient to preserve his complexion from the injuries of the sun and weather. Our tyrant having left the ship, and carried his favorite Macshane along with him, to my inexpressible satisfaction, our new commander came on board in a 10-oared barge, overshadowed with a vast umbrella, and appeared in everything the reverse of oakum, being a tall, thin young man dressed in this manner. A white hat, garnished with a red feather, adorned his head, from whence his hair flowed upon his shoulders, in ringlets tied behind with a ribbon. His coat, consisting of pink-colored silk, lined with white, by the elegance of the cut retired backward, as it were, to discover a white satin waistcoat embroidered with gold, unbuttoned at the upper part to display a brooch set with garnets, that glittered in the breast of his shirt, which was of the finest cambric, edged with right mechlin. The knees of his crimson velvet breeches scarce descended so low as to meet his silk stockings, which rose without spot or wrinkle on his meager legs, from shoes of blue mariquin, studded with diamond buckles that flamed forth rivals to the sun. A steel-hilted sword, inlaid with gold, and decked with a knot of ribbon which fell down in a rich tassel, equipped his side, and an amber-headed cane hung dangling from his wrist. But the most remarkable parts of his furniture were a mask on his face and white gloves on his hands, which did not seem to be put on with an intention to be pulled off occasionally, but were fixed with a curious ring on the little finger of each hand. In this garb, Captain Whiffle, for that was his name, took possession of the ship, surrounded with a crowd of attendants, all of whom, in their different degrees, seemed to be of their patron's disposition, and the air was so impregnated with perfumes that one may venture to affirm the climate of Arabia Felix was not half so sweet-scented. My fellow-mate, observing no surgeon among his train, thought he had found an occasion too favorable for himself to be neglected, and, remembering the old proverb, "Spare to speak and spare to speed," resolved to solicit the new captain's interest immediately, before any other surgeon could be appointed for the ship. With this view he repaired to the cabin in his ordinary dress, consisting of a check shirt and trousers, a brown linen waistcoat, and a nightcap of the same, neither of them very clean, which, for his further misfortune, happened to smell strong of tobacco. Entering without any ceremony into this sacred place, he found Captain Whiffle reposing upon a couch, with a wrapper of fine chintz about his body, and a muslin cap bordered with lace about his head. and after several low congees began in this manner. Sir, I hope you will forgive and excuse and pardon the presumption of one who has not the honor of being known to you, but who is, nevertheless, a gentleman born and bred, and moreover has had misfortunes, caught help me, in the world. Here he was interrupted by the captain, who, on seeing him, had started up with great amazement at the novelty of the apparition, and having recollected himself, pronounced with a look and tone signifying disdain, curiosity, and surprise, "Zounds! Who art thou?" "I am surgeon's first mate on board of this ship," replied Morgan, "and I most vehemently desire and beseech you with all submission to be pleased to condescend and vouchsafe to inquire into my character, and my behaviour, and my deserts, which, undercaught, I hope, will entitle me to the vacancy of surgeon." As he proceeded in his speech, he continued advancing towards the captain, whose nostrils were no sooner saluted with the aromatic flavor that exhaled from him than he cried with great emotion, "Heaven preserve me! I am suffocated. Fellow, away with thee. Curse thee, fellow, get thee gone. I shall be stunk to death." At the noise of his outcries, his servants ran into his apartment, and he accosted them thus: "Villains! Cut-throats! Traitors, I am betrayed. I am sacrificed. Will you not carry that monster away? Or must I be stifled with the stench of him? Oh, oh!" With these interjections he sank down upon his settee in a fit. His valeted chamber plied him with a smelling bottle. One footman chafed his temples with Hungary water. Another sprinkled the floor with spirits of lavender. A third pushed Morgan out of the cabin, who, coming to the place where I was, sat down with a demure countenance, and according to his custom, when he received any indignity which he durst not revenge, began to sing a Welsh ditty. I guessed he was under some agitation of spirits and desired to know the cause. But instead of answering me directly, he asked with great emotion if I thought him a monster and a stinkard. "A monster and a stinkard," said I with some surprise. "Did anybody call you so?" "Cot is my judge," replied B. "Captain Fiffle did call me both. I and all the waters in the Toy will not wash it out of my remembrance. I do affirm and avouch, and maintain with my soul and my pody and my plude, look you, that I have no smells about me, but such as a Christian ought to have, except the effluvia of tobacco, which is a cephalic, odoriferous, aromatic herb, and he is a son of a mountain goat who says otherwise. As for my being a minister, let that be as it is. I am as Cot was pleased to create me, which, peradventure, is more than I shall ever aver of him who gave me that title. For I will proclaim it before the world, that he is disguised and transfigured and transmogrified with affectation and whimsies, and that he is more like a papoon than of the human race. Chapter 35. Captain Whiffle sends for me, his situation described. His surgeon arrives, prescribes for him, and puts him to bed. A bed is put up for Mr. Simper contiguous to the state-room, which, with other parts of the captain's behavior, gives the ship's company a very unfavorable idea of their commander. I am detained in the West Indies by the admiral, and go on board of the Lizard sloop of war in quality of surgeon's mate, where I make myself known to the surgeon, who treats me very kindly. I go on shore, sell my ticket, purchase necessaries, and at my return on board am surprised at the sight of Crampley, who is appointed lieutenant of the sloop. We sail on a cruise, take a prize in which I arrive at Port Morant under the command of my messmate, with whom I live in great harmony. He was going on with an eulogium upon the captain, when I received a message to clean myself and go up to the great cabin. And with this command I instantly complied, sweetening myself with rosewater from the medicine chest. When I entered the room, I was ordered to stand by the door until Captain Whiffle had reconnoitered me at a distance with a spyglass. He, having consulted one sense in this manner, bade me advance gradually, that his nose might have intelligence before it could be much offended. I therefore approached with great caution and success, and he was pleased to say, "Aye, this creature is tolerable." I found him lolling on his couch with a languishing air, his head supported by his valet-de-chamber, who from time to time applied a smelling bottle to his nose. "Vergette," said he in a squeaking tone, "dost think this wretch, meaning me, will do me no injury?" "May I venture to submit my arm to him?" "'Pon my word," replied the valet, "I do tink dat dare be great occasion for your honor losing a small quantite of blot, and the young man of a quelk chose of de bon mine." "Well, then," said his master, "I think I must venture." Then, addressing himself to me, "Hast thou ever blooded anybody but brutes?" "But I need not ask thee, for thou wilt tell me a most able lie." "Brutes, sir," answered I, pulling down his glove in order to feel his pulse. "I never meddle with brutes." "What the devil art thou about?" cried he. "Dost thou intend to twist off my hand?" Gad's curse. My arm is benumbed up to the very shoulder. Heaven have mercy upon me. Must I perish under the hands of savages? What an unfortunate dog was I to come on board without my own surgeon, Mr. Simper. I craved pardon for having handled him so roughly, and with the utmost care and tenderness tied up his arm with a fillet of silk. While I was feeling for the vein, he desired to know how much blood I intended to take from him, and when I answered, "Not above 12 ounces," started up with a look full of horror, and bade me be gone, swearing I had a design upon his life. Vergette appeased him with difficulty, and, opening a bureau, took out a pair of scales, in one of which was placed a small cup, and putting them into my hand, told me, the captain never lost above an ounce and 3 drams at one time. While I prepared for this important evacuation, there came into the cabin a young man gaily dressed, of a very delicate complexion with a kind of languid smile on his face, which seemed to have been rendered habitual by a long course of affectation. The captain no sooner perceived him, than rising hastily, he flew into his arms, crying, "Oh, my dear Simper, I am excessively disordered. I have been betrayed, frighted, murdered, by the negligence of my servants, who suffered a beast, a mule, a bear, to surprise me, and stink me into convulsions with the fumes of tobacco." Simper, who by this time, I found, was obliged to act for the clearness of his complexion, assumed an air of softness and sympathy, and lamented with many tender expressions of sorrow the sad accident that had thrown him into that condition. Then, feeling his patient's pulse on the outside of his glove, gave it as his opinion that his disorder was entirely nervous, and that some drops of tincture of castor and liquid laudanum would be of more service to him than bleeding, by bridling the inordinate sallies of his spirits and composing the fermentation of his bile. I was therefore sent to prepare this prescription, which was administered in a glass of sack posset, after the captain had been put to bed, and orders sent to the officers on the quarter-deck to let nobody walk on that side under which he lay. While the captain enjoyed his repose, the doctor watched over him, and indeed became so necessary that a cabin was made for him contiguous to the state-room where Whiffle slept, that he might be at hand in case of accidents in the night. Next day, our commander, being happily recovered, gave orders that none of the lieutenants should appear upon deck without a wig, sword, and ruffles, nor any midshipman or other petty officer be seen with a check shirt or dirty linen. He also prohibited any person whatever, except Simper and his own servants, from coming into the great cabin without first sending in to obtain leave. These singular regulations did not prepossess the ship's company in his favor, but, on the contrary, gave Scandal an opportunity to be very busy with his character and accuse him of maintaining a correspondence with his surgeon not fit to be named. In a few weeks, our ship being under sailing orders, I was in hope of revisiting my native country in a very short time when the Admiral's surgeon came on board, and sending for Morgan and me to the quarterdeck, gave us to understand there was a great scarcity of surgeons in the West Indies, that he was commanded to detain one mate out of every great ship that was bound for England, and desired us to agree between ourselves, before the next day at that hour, which of us should stay behind. We were thunderstruck at this proposal, and stared at one another some time without speaking. At length the Welshman broke silence, and offered to remain in the West Indies, provided the Admiral would give him a surgeon's warrant immediately. But he was told there was no want of chief surgeons, and that he must be contented with the station of mate till he should be further provided for in due course. Whereupon Morgan flatly refused to quit the ship for which the commissioners of the Navy had appointed him, and the other told him as plainly that if we could not determine the affair by ourselves before tomorrow morning, he must cast lots and abide by his chance. When I recalled to my remembrance the miseries I had undergone in England, where I had not one friend to promote my interest or favor my advancement in the Navy, and the same time reflected on the present dearth of surgeons in the West Indies, and the unhealthiness of the climate, which every day almost reduced the number, I could not help thinking my success would be much more certain and expeditious by my staying where I was than by returning to Europe. I therefore resolved to comply with a good grace, and next day, when we were ordered to throw dice, told Morgan he needed not trouble himself, for I would voluntarily submit to the Admiral's pleasure. This frank declaration was commended by the gentleman, who assured me it should not fare the worse with me for my resignation. Indeed, he was as good as his word, and that very afternoon procured a warrant, appointing me surgeon's mate of the Lizard sloop of war, which put me on a footing with every first mate in the service. My ticket being made out, I put my chest and bedding on board a canoe that lay alongside, and having shook hands with my trusty friend the sergeant, and honest Jack Ratlin, who was bound for Greenwich Hospital, I took my leave of Morgan with many tears, after we had exchanged our sleeve buttons as remembrances of each other. Having presented my new warrant to the captain of the Lizard, I inquired for the doctor, whom I no sooner saw than I recollected him to be one of those young fellows with whom I had been committed to the roundhouse during our frolic with Jackson, as I have related before. He received me with a good deal of courtesy, and when I put him in mind of our former acquaintance, expressed great joy at seeing me again, and recommended me to an exceeding good mess, composed of the gunner and master's mate. As there was not one sick person in the ship, I got leave to go ashore next day with the gunner, who recommended me to a Jew, that bought my ticket at the rate of 40% discount, and, having furnished myself with the necessaries I wanted, returned on board in the evening, and, to my surprise, found my old antagonist cramply walking upon deck. Though I did not fear his enmity, I was shocked at his appearance, and communicated my sentiments on that subject to Mr. Tomlins the surgeon, who told me that Cramply, by dint of some friends about the Admiral, had procured a commission, constituting him lieutenant on board the Lizard, and advised me, now he was my superior officer, to behave with some respect towards him, or else he would find 1,000 opportunities of using me ill. This advice was a bitter potion to me, whom pride and resentment had rendered utterly incapable of the least submission to, or even of a reconciliation with, the wretch who had, on many occasions, treated me so inhumanly. However, I resolved to have as little connection as possible with him, and to ingratiate myself as much as I could with the rest of the officers, whose friendship might be a bulwark to defend me from the attempts of his malice. In less than a week we sailed on a cruise, and having weathered the east end of the island, had the good fortune to take a Spanish barcalongo, with her prize, which was an English ship bound for Bristol, that sailed from Jamaica a fortnight before, without convoy. All the prisoners who were well, we put on shore on the north side of the island. The prizes were manned with Englishmen, and the command of the barcalongo given to my friend, the master's mate, with orders to carry them into Port Morant, and there to remain until the Lizard's cruise should be ended, at which time she would touch at the same place in her way to Port Royal. With him I was sent to attend the wounded Spaniards as well as Englishmen, who amounted to 16, and to take care of them on shore in a house that was to be hired as an hospital. This destination gave me a great deal of pleasure, as I should, for some time, be freed from the arrogance of Crampley, whose inveteracy against me had already broken out on 2 or 3 occasions since he was become a lieutenant. My messmate, who very much resembled my uncle, both in figure and disposition, treated me on board of the prize with the utmost civility and confidence, and, among other favors, made me a present of a silver-hilted hanger, and a pair of pistols mounted with the same metal, which fell to his share in plundering the enemy. We arrived safely at Morant, and, going on shore, pitched upon an empty storehouse, which we hired for the reception of the wounded, who were brought to it next day, with beds and other necessaries, and 4 of the ship's company appointed to attend them and obey me.